Imagine standing alone in a frozen ditch, just 18 inches deep, with 6 massive Tiger tanks rumbling straight toward you, their cannons booming like thunder. Behind them, hundreds of battle-hardened German soldiers advance through the snow, rifles gleaming under the pale winter sun. You're not a seasoned commando or a tank commander, you're a 25-year-old tobacco farmer from rural Kentucky, barely 5 feet 6 inches tall, weighing 120 pounds, with wounds from 7 previous injuries still aching. No high school diploma, no military academy training, just sheer grit forged from 4 years of relentless war. And in your hands, not a weapon, but a telephone and a spool of wire. One wrong move, and an entire American battalion crumbles. But what if I told you this unassuming man didn't just survive? He turned the tide of a desperate battle, saving hundreds of lives and shattering a German offensive that could have prolonged the war. How did he do it? Stick around, because the story of First Lieutenant Garland Merl Connor is about to unfold, revealing layers of courage and ingenuity that history almost forgot. It was January 24, 1945, in the icy grip of the Colmar Pocket, a stubborn 850-square-mile bulge of German-held territory in Alsace, France, the last foothold the Nazis clung to west of the Rhine River. 4 months, Allied forces had hammered at it, but the Germans refused to yield. The French First Army alone had suffered thousands of casualties in failed assaults. Meanwhile, Hitler's final gasps in the West included Operation Nordwind, launched on New Year's Day, aiming to punch through American lines while the Battle of the Bulge raged 300 miles north. Though Nordwind faltered, the 19th Army in the pocket remained defiant, desperate to hold the line amid freezing temperatures that plunged to 10 degrees below zero. Snow blanketed the landscape, turning forests and fields into a white hell where soldiers huddled in foxholes, fighting frostbite as much as the enemy. 3rd Battalion, 7th Infantry Regiment, part of the U.S. 3rd Infantry Division, had been entrenched on the front for 18 grueling days. Known as the Rock of the Marne for their stand in World War I, these men were veterans of brutal campaigns, from North Africa to Sicily, Italy's mud-choked hills, the bloody Anzio beachhead, and the liberation of southern France. But here, near Haguenau, not Husson, as some early reports misstated, they faced unrelenting probes, nightly German patrols, sniper fire, and artillery that claimed 43 lives in just 2 weeks. Morale teetered. Sleep was a luxury in those frozen holes, where moonlight was absent and the wind howled like a banshee. Enter Garland Merl Connor, the battalion's intelligence officer. Born in 1919 on a modest farm in Clinton County, Kentucky, where the nearest school was a 15-mile trek over rugged terrain, Connor left education behind early to help his family tend tobacco and corn. Enlisting in March 1941, before Pearl Harbor drew America fully into the fray, he rose through the ranks not by pedigree but by proven valor. By 1945, he'd endured 10 major campaigns, including 4 amphibious assaults that tested the soul. Wounded 7 times, shrapnel in Italy, blasts at Anzio, fragments in France, he'd just returned from the hospital 2 days prior, his latest injuries barely healed. Yet, as an S2 officer, his role was analytical, poring over maps, interrogating prisoners, synthesizing patrol intel to pinpoint enemy movements. He wasn't meant for the front lines. But Connor's record told a different tale. 4 silver stars already pinned to his chest for charging into chaos to rescue comrades, actions that went far beyond his duties. At 0700 that fateful morning, Connor stood in the battalion command post, a makeshift shelter amid the trees, as German artillery unleashed fury 400 yards ahead. The barrage shredded the tree line, a prelude to what reconnaissance warned, a massive counterattack by 600 infantry from the 19th Army, supported by 6 Mark VI Tiger tanks, behemoths weighing 60 tons each, armored like fortresses, armed with deadly 88mm guns that could obliterate anything in their path. The Tigers, symbols of German engineering prowess, had terrorized allies across Europe, their thick sloped armor deflecting most shells. This assault aimed to rupture the American flank, potentially collapsing the sector and buying time for the pocket's defenders. The battalion commander stared at the map, tension thick as the fog. No U.S. tanks or destroyers were in position to counter. Artillery was their only hope, but it required eyes on the target, a forward observer to guide the shells precisely. The initial observation post lay in ruins from the barrage, its occupants silenced. From the command post, dense woods obscured the view. Someone had to venture out, across 400 yards of exposed, snow-covered ground, under enemy fire, to spot the advance. As the barrage lifted at 0715, replaced by the ominous growl of tank engines, a runner burst in. Germans advancing, 6 Tigers, hundreds of infantry hitting our left flank. Panic flickered in the room. If those Tigers breached, they'd crush foxholes like tin cans, routing the battalion. Connor, ever the quiet force, studied the map one last time. He grabbed a field telephone and 400 yards of wire spool, crude tools in a high-stakes gamble. Without a word, he met the commander's gaze and stepped into the blizzard-whipped dawn. The ground crunched under his boots as he sprinted, wire unspooling behind like a lifeline. At 100 yards, German guns roared back to life, shells bracketing him, 40 yards left, 30 right. Observers had spotted the lone figure. They adjusted mercilessly. A tree exploded 70 yards ahead, showering splinters. Connor leaped onward, undeterred. Another blast 20 yards behind slammed him like a wall, but he regained footing. Vaulting a fallen trunk at 250 yards, shrapnel hissed around him. His ears rang from a near miss at 300 yards, vision blurring, but he pressed beyond the American foxholes, where stunned soldiers watched this intelligence officer charge toward doom. 30 yards ahead of the line, he dove into a shallow ditch. Barely concealment, but enough for a sight line. Cranking the handset, he connected to the artillery fire direction center 3 miles rearward. 12 105mm howitzers, packing 14 pounds of explosive per shell. Fire mission, enemy infantry in the open, 600 meters. Adjusting. Heart pounding, he peered over the rim. German squads darted through trees 200 yards out, disciplined rushes under covering fire. Behind, 4 Tigers loomed, smashing saplings, their commanders scanning from turrets. 2 more emerged, all 6 now visible, inexorable. The Germans hadn't spotted him yet. Alone, exposed, with infantry closing, Connor whispered coordinates. 40 seconds later, the sky howled. First salvo landed 150 yards behind, too far. Drop 100. Fire for effect. The second hammered the formation's heart, trees vaporizing, shrapnel ripping through ranks. The advance halted, men scattered. Repeat fire. Salvos pounded relentlessly, 48 shells per minute saturating 200 square yards. Infantry dove for cover, formations shattered. But the Tigers pressed on, shells glancing off their hides. One fired, obliterating a foxhole to Connor's right. Another followed suit. They were 300 yards from the line, minutes from overrun. Shifting focus, Connor called, "Enemy armor advancing, 250 meters." Precision was key. Artillery rarely felled tanks outright. Shells rained. One snapped a lead Tiger's track, immobilizing it. Smoke billowed from another's engine. Yet 4 advanced, veering toward him. They'd traced the wire, seen his flashes. Hatches closed. They charged to silence the voice summoning death. Pinned, Connor made the unthinkable call. "Fire on my position." Confirmation came hesitantly. Shells on friendly coordinates risked everything. But he affirmed. 40 seconds. Blasts 30 yards out pummeled him, lungs compressing, dirt fontaining. Drop 20. Heat scorched his face. Fragments screamed overhead. The Tigers halted, commanders ducking. Infantry rallied behind, using armor as shields. Connor walked fire across them, a deadly dance based on sight and sound. An hour in, numbness crept from the cold. His aide, a private, crawled up with backup wire, spotting threats. German artillery countered, bracketing the ditch. Connor called back, silencing their guns. The battle raged, smoke shells mixed in, obscuring but not stopping the foe. One Tiger emerged 70 yards out, blasting a machine gun nest. Danger close. Shells enveloped it, shattering vision ports, stranding it in a crater. As the last Tiger closed to 60 yards, infantry inches away through fog, Connor's world narrowed to survival and salvation. What happened next would etch his name in legend, but that's for the next part. The German infantry were now inside 50 yards, close enough that Connor could hear their boots crunching through the snow. hear the low metallic snap of Mauser bolts being worked, hear officers barking urgent commands in clipped German. Smoke still hung thick from the phosphorus shells, turning the battlefield into a ghostly chessboard where every shadow could hide death. The last operational Tiger tank loomed just 40 yards from the American foxholes, its massive 88mm gun slowly traversing, hunting for the next target to annihilate. Inside that steel monster, the commander had popped his hatch again, standing tall, binoculars scanning the line, choosing which foxhole to erase next. Connor's world had shrunk to a frozen ditch, a telephone handset, and the lives of an entire battalion hanging on his next words. He had been lying prone for nearly 2 hours now. His fingers were so numb from the -10-degree cold that he could barely feel the handset. Ice had formed on his eyelashes. Every breath burned his lungs. Frozen dirt kept falling into his mouth and eyes from near misses. Yet he never once thought of retreating. If he pulled back even 30 yards, the artillery would lose its eyes. The Germans would mass, surge forward, and break through. Hundreds of American boys who had mothers waiting back home, boys who had just turned 19, boys who still believed they would see Christmas 1945, would die. So he stayed. The private beside him, the young intelligence assistant who had crawled out with extra wire, was bleeding steadily from a shrapnel wound in his thigh. The cold had slowed the bleeding to a sluggish ooze, but the boy was pale, shaking. Still, he refused to leave. He kept his M1 carbine pointed toward the smoke, whispering target locations to Connor. Movement, 10 o'clock, squad strength, they're crawling now. Connor adjusted fire again. Drop 5. Fire for effect. High explosive, maximum concentration. The shells came screaming down, closer than ever. The ground heaved. The blast wave slammed both men flat. Connor felt his body lift off the bottom of the ditch and crash back down. His ears went completely silent for several long seconds, only ringing, endless ringing. When sound returned, it was muffled, distant, like listening underwater. But the Germans who had been 10 yards away were gone. The last Tiger was now blind and immobile, its driver's periscope shattered, its vision blocks blown out. The crew bailed out under heavy rifle fire from the foxholes. American bargunners and riflemen cut down 3 of the 5 men as they ran. The other 2 vanished into the swirling snow and smoke. All 6 Tigers, the pride of the 19th Army's Armored Reserve, were now burning hulks, smoking wrecks, or abandoned hulks that American salvage teams would later drag back for study. Yet the infantry fight was far from over. Hundreds of German veterans still remained, at least 400 after the initial slaughter. These were not green conscripts. Many had fought since 1941 on the Eastern Front. They knew how to survive artillery, how to use shell craters for cover, how to advance in small teams under fire. They began regrouping in the tree-line 200 to 300 yards away, dragging wounded comrades, redistributing ammunition, preparing for one final, all-out push. Connor never let them breathe. He walked the barrage methodically, left to right, then right to left, like a farmer scything wheat. Every time a platoon tried to form up behind a fallen tree, shells obliterated the tree and the men. Every time a squad tried to crawl forward through a crater, high-explosive rounds turned the crater into a grave. He mixed in smoke shells to blind their advance, then followed with heat to punish anyone who dared move through the murk. The German artillery observers finally locked onto his exact position. Their 150mm howitzers opened up in counter-battery fire. Shells began walking toward the ditch, 25 yards behind, then 20, then 15. The ground shook harder with each salvo. Frozen earth rained down like shrapnel. One German round landed 10 yards to Connor's left. The concussion flipped him onto his back. Another landed 10 yards right. They had him perfectly bracketed. One more correct adjustment, and the ditch would become his tomb. Connor didn't flinch. He called counter-battery fire of his own. Enemy artillery, grid coordinates. He read off the map references he had memorized weeks earlier from patrol reports and sound-ranging data. The American 105s shifted targets, pounding the German gun positions 3 miles back. Within minutes the incoming shells slowed, then stopped. The German batteries were either silenced, destroyed, or their crews had abandoned their pieces and run for cover. Back to the infantry. The sun climbed higher. Full daylight now exposed the carnage. 6 gutted Tigers smoking across 400 yards of field, hundreds of shell craters overlapping like a diseased moonscape, German bodies scattered in clumps, some still twitching, others frozen in grotesque poses. The surviving Germans could see it all. They could see one lone American officer lying in a ditch ahead of his own lines, calmly calling down hell on anyone who moved. And they began to break. But not all at once. A determined company, perhaps 120 men, formed up under the last intact section of Trilene. Their officer, a tall hauptmann with a scarred face, rallied them with shouted orders and hand signals. They fixed bayonets. They knew the American artillery had to be running low on ammunition. They had counted the rate of fire, timed the pauses. They believed they had a window, a narrow, bloody window, to close the distance and overrun the ditch before the guns could reload. They were wrong. Connor sensed the shift. He saw the bayonets glint. He saw squads peel off left and right, trying to flank. He called it instantly. Infantry massing, Trilene, 280 meters. Adjust fire. Continuous fire mission. Walking barrage. Keep it rolling. The howitzers answered with everything they had left. Maximum rate, every tube speaking at once. The forest edge disappeared in a continuous wall of flame and black smoke. Trees snapped like matchsticks. Men were lifted into the air and thrown backward. The hauptmann vanished in the first salvo. The flanking squads were caught in the open, they melted under the barrage. The survivors dove back into craters, screaming for medics who would never arrive. 10 minutes later the fire direction center came on the net. Ammunition critical. 5 minutes remaining at current rate. Then we go silent until resupply. 5 minutes. Connor knew what that meant. 5 minutes without artillery was an eternity in this fight. The Germans would use it. They would swarm. They would cut the telephone wire. They would overrun the battalion. He made his decision. He would hold the line until the very last shell. He shifted fire to create a final curtain, a 100-yard deep killing zone between the ditch and the German survivors. Every time a head popped up, every time a man tried to crawl forward, shells answered. He used sound now as much as sight, the crunch of boots, the clink of equipment, the low shouts in German. He walked the barrage back and forth like a deadly metronome. The private beside him whispered, "Sir, they're pulling back." Connor raised his head just enough to see. The Germans were retreating, not running, but withdrawing in disciplined teams, dragging wounded, covering each other with smoke grenades and machine pistol fire. They left their dead where they fell. They left their burning tanks. They left the broken offensive that Hitler had demanded would split the Allied line. 3 full hours had passed since Connor left the command post. His body was finished, muscles locked, joints frozen, shoulder bleeding again from an unnoticed shrapnel hit hours earlier. But his mind was razor sharp. He stayed in the ditch another 20 minutes, watching, waiting, making sure this was not a feint, making sure no second wave was forming in the distant trees. Only when he was certain did he finally stand. His legs buckled twice before holding. He pulled the wounded private up, slung the boy's arm over his shoulder, and began the slow walk back to the American line, 30 yards that felt like 30 miles. Soldiers climbed out of foxholes to stare. They had watched the entire drama unfold, the lone figure sprinting into hell with a telephone, the endless artillery storms, the burning Tigers, the Germans breaking and running. They didn't cheer. They didn't speak. They just stared, in awe, in disbelief, in something close to reverence. The battalion commander met them at the line. He looked at the cratered wasteland, at the destroyed tanks, at the retreating enemy, at the exhausted, bloodied lieutenant still supporting his wounded comrade. He didn't say a word. He simply nodded, once. That nod said everything. Medics took the private to the aid station. The cold had frozen his wound, he would lose no leg, and he would return to duty in 6 weeks. Connor walked, limped, back to the command post. A medic cut open his coat, found the shrapnel buried in his shoulder, extracted it, and bandaged the wound. "You're lucky, Lieutenant," the medic said. Connor didn't answer. Luck had nothing to do with it. The battlefield fell silent. No more tank engines. No more rifle cracks. No more artillery screaming overhead. Only the low moan of wind through splintered trees and the faint, heartbreaking calls of wounded men, German voices mostly, drifting from the distant tree line where survivors dragged themselves away. 3 hours and 20 minutes after First Lieutenant Garland Merl Connor had walked out of the command post with a telephone and a spool of wire, the German counterattack was finished. He had stopped 6 Tiger tanks, machines that had terrified entire divisions across Europe. He had broken the back of 600 veteran infantry. Intelligence teams later confirmed at least 53 German dead on the field, another 78 severely wounded and left behind when the retreat began. The true toll was higher, most likely over 150 killed and wounded when you counted those dragged back into the German lines. All 6 Tigers were destroyed or abandoned. The 19th Army's armored spearhead had been shattered in a single morning by one man lying in a frozen ditch. 3rd Battalion lost 11 killed and 23 wounded that day, most of them before Connor ever reached the ditch. After he began directing fire, American casualties dropped to almost 0. The Germans never mounted another serious attack on that sector. The Colmar Pocket's days were numbered. On February 9, 1945, the final Allied push began. By early March the pocket was eliminated, and the Rhine lay open. Back at the command post, Connor sat quietly while a medic dug a small piece of shrapnel out of his shoulder, a wound he hadn't even noticed during the fight. The medic shook his head. "You shouldn't even be walking, Lieutenant." Connor just shrugged. He never wrote about that day. He never bragged. When men in the battalion tried to thank him, he changed the subject or walked away. To him, it was simply what needed doing. On February 10, Lieutenant General Alexander Patch, commander of 7th Army, arrived at the battalion area. He stood in the snow, pinned the Distinguished Service Cross to Connor's chest, and read the citation aloud. It described the 400-yard run under fire, the 3 hours of exposed observation, the decision to call artillery on his own position when the enemy closed to within yards. The battalion commander had already recommended Connor for the Medal of Honor. The paperwork began its slow climb through division, corps, and army channels. But time worked against him. Connor had been in continuous combat for 28 months, an extraordinary stretch even by 1945 standards. He had been wounded 7 times. The army wanted him home. In mid-March he left France on a transport ship, arriving in New York 3 weeks later. He was honorably discharged on June 22, 1945, just weeks before the war in Europe officially ended. He went back to Clinton County, Kentucky. Albany threw him a parade in May. People lined the streets, waved flags, cheered the quiet farmer who had somehow become a war hero. Alvin York, the most famous Medal of Honor recipient of World War I, came from nearby Pall Mall, Tennessee, to speak at the ceremony. York understood. He shook Connor's hand and said very little. Some things don't need many words. At that parade Connor met Pauline Wells, 20 years old, bright-eyed, and already hearing the stories about what this small, soft-spoken man had done across the ocean. She couldn't quite believe them. He didn't talk about the war. When people asked, he said the memories stayed in France. He wasn't bringing them home. They married on July 9, 1945. They built a life on Indian Creek, no electricity, no running water, just a small farm worked with mules and horses. Tobacco, corn, the same crops his family had raised for generations. In 1950 the government bought their land for the new Lake Cumberland Reservoir. They moved a few miles away to the Roland community, started over, planted again, lived simply. Connor became president of the Clinton County Farm Bureau for 17 years. He helped neighbors with crop rotation, soil conservation, government forms, anything that made farming a little less punishing. He stayed active in veterans organizations, Paralyzed Veterans of America, Disabled American Veterans, traveling to nearby counties to help other veterans file claims, cut through red tape, get the benefits they had earned. He never spoke about January 24, 1945. Pauline asked him once, early in their marriage, what really happened in France. What had he done to earn all those medals? He looked at her for a long moment and said, "I did what needed to be done. That's all there is to it." Then he changed the subject. The medals stayed in a cardboard box, inside a duffel bag, in the back of the living room closet for more than 50 years. In 1996, a veteran named Richard Chilton wrote to the Connor home. He was researching his uncle, Private Gordon Roberts, killed at Anzio in January 1944. He asked if Connor remembered anything. Connor invited him over. They sat in the living room. Connor was 77 now, diabetic, kidneys failing, 2 years left at most. He spoke quietly about Anzio, about Roberts. He described carrying the dying private to an aid station, staying with him until the end. As he told the story, tears came. 52 years later, the memory still broke him. Pauline suggested Chilton look through Connor's records. She brought out the duffel bag, the cardboard box. Chilton opened it. He read the citations. His hands began to shake. He looked up at the quiet man in the chair and said one sentence. "This man should have been awarded the Medal of Honor." Chilton started the long fight. He filed paperwork with the Army Board for correction of military records. He gathered eyewitness statements from men who had watched from the foxholes that day. Men who saw Connor lie in that ditch for 3 hours, calling fire on himself, never moving. The board rejected the application in 1997. Rejected the appeal in 2000. Connor died on November 5, 1998. He was 79. He was buried in Memorial Hill Cemetery in Albany. The Distinguished Service Cross went into the ground with him. But Pauline did not stop. She collected more statements. She found 3 more soldiers who had been in those foxholes on January 24. Men who had seen the impossible with their own eyes. She resubmitted the case in 2008. Nothing happened. Historians took up the cause. Stephen Ambrose wrote about Connor in 2000, calling his actions far above the call of duty. The Rhode Island Senate passed a resolution in 2005 urging the upgrade. 7 retired generals wrote letters of support. Still nothing. In 2014, Pauline filed suit in federal court. A judge ruled she had waited too long. She appealed to the 6th Circuit. The case went to mediation. During one session, the government attorney, a woman whose own father had served in 3rd Battalion and had been wounded on January 25, one day after Connor's stand, broke down crying. She told Pauline that Connor may have saved her father's life. In 2015, the Army Board finally recommended the upgrade. Congress passed special legislation waiving the time limit. On March 29, 2018, the White House made the announcement. On June 26, 2018, President Trump presented the Medal of Honor to Pauline Wells Connor in the East Room. She was 89 years old. 22 years had passed since Richard Chilton opened that cardboard box. 20 years since Garland died. The citation was read aloud. First Lieutenant Garland Merl Connor distinguished himself by acts of gallantry and intrepidity, volunteered to advance 400 yards through intense enemy fire, directed artillery fire for 3 hours from an exposed forward position, called fire upon his own location when the enemy closed within yards, destroyed 6 Tiger tanks, inflicted heavy casualties on the enemy, prevented the overrun of his battalion. Pauline held the medal in her hands, the medal her husband never sought, never displayed, never even mentioned, because he believed talking about it would be bragging. He was the 2nd most decorated soldier of World War II after Audie Murphy, and for most of his life, almost no one knew his name. If this story touched you, if it reminded you what real courage looks like, what quiet men from small towns can do when everything is on the line, do me a favor. Hit that like button right now. Every like tells YouTube to show this story to more people who need to hear it. Subscribe and turn on notifications. We're digging up these forgotten heroes every single day, Ordinary people who did extraordinary things and asked for nothing in return. Drop a comment below. Tell us where you're watching from: United States, United Kingdom, Canada, Australia, India, anywhere. Tell us if someone in your family served. Just let us know you're here. Because men like Garland Merl Connor deserve to be remembered, and you're the reason their names won't fade into silence. Thank you for watching. And thank you for keeping their memory alive.